friends, welcome back. I'm Christina, the manager at the Pacific Beach Library. It is day 14 of our read-along together of Roughing It by Mark Twain. Okay, let's go ahead and start and we'll get ready for our day together. Today's tea that I'm enjoying is the Rosa de Jamaica, which would just be a pinky rose, strawberry flavor in hibiscus with some lemon myrtle, a delicious loose leaf tea. Let's go in and have some of that. I love the color on this one. It's a beautiful rubyish garnet color. So pretty, so pretty. And then just that lemon myrtle adds a bit of citrus flavor, even though it's not actually lemon, it's just a lemon flavored myrtle. Very good. This one has not been steeping long, so it's really hot still. That's why I was being very hesitant with that sip. But I've had it before. It's worth steaming up my glasses for. And I know I'm going to enjoy that one even more when it cools down a little bit. Okay, so I thought we'd start by talking a little bit about the reading that we did yesterday, and then we will go into today's two chapters. Let's see. Yesterday we just read 3. Let's see, we talked about... He was talking about just sort of giving an idea of what life was like in Virginia. And I always want to say Virginia City, but I think, is that the name in like one of the towns in Bonanza or something like that, or one of the Western shows? But in the city of Virginia, in the territory of Nevada, where he lived, and he talks a bit about a gentleman who died and the elaborate funeral that they held for him. There's a wonderful scene too about a gentleman who was a friend of the deceased. And this guy was named Scotty, and he goes and he speaks to the new reverend, the parson in town. And this clergyman is from the East. He's new to the territory. He does not yet speak the slang. And so he comes and he's quite formal in how he is speaking. And when the other guy's like, I'm looking for a reverend who can do the service for my dead friend. But instead, it comes out with all these colloquialisms, and the clergyman is just so confused as to what he's saying, and then the other man is confused by what the clergyman is saying, that the two of them, there's this huge long scene, really fun, talking about just the two of them trying to understand each other so they can make the plan for the funeral. Lovely. Let's see, they also talked too about how there are a lot of tough guys in this area, that there were the original 26 graves in the cemetery in Virginia were all occupied by murdered men, because it was sort of like a thing to do, like a way to establish your name was to kill somebody. Like that means you're a guy who's tough and who's not to be, to be messed with. And so quite a bit of that. Let's see. He gave a few other vignettes too, like he shared some articles from the newspaper about like a crime, and then like how this officer had been involved in apprehending the criminal, but then that same officer later on becomes a criminal himself, and then on, just like how these folks were so tough, I guess. I mean, I don't know if that's quite the right word for it, but just that they are very violent, they are rough around the edges, and they are quite okay just to, somebody's arguing with you, kill them. And, and that's going to gain you respect and the approbation of everyone else, rather than to be sent to jail by a trial. And so, yeah, he said, not less than 100 men have been murdered in Nevada, perhaps even 300. And as far as I can learn, only 2 persons have suffered the death penalty there. However, 4 or 5 who had no money and no political influence have been punished by imprisonment, one for as long as 8 months. But he doesn't want to be an exaggerator. It may have been less than 8 months. So there you go. That's our story. Today we just have 2 chapters. The second is rather long, and as mentioned yesterday, it is our longest chapter of the book. Now, I will say it does include a really long poem, and so I do try not to read ahead, just so you know. Like, I don't, like, since I haven't read this book before, I like the idea of being surprised with you about what's going to happen, but I do skim a tiny bit just so I can try to figure out, like, what's the pagination. Like, I want to try to have it within an hour. And I did notice in this one that it has this really long poem, and it looks like it's the second and fourth lines of each each verse are supposed to rhyme with each other. So I will be doing a little bit of exaggerating in some of my pronunciation to get them to work together. So I'm just warning you about that now. And then also I did want to say too, when I was skimming the pages, there have been several instances in the book where I've mentioned that, you know, these are things of the time. I did notice this chapter coming up has the N-word a couple times in there again. And once again, in advance, I want to apologize for that. It is part of the story, so I'm reading it as it was written. And I do apologize. Okay. Whew. All right. So today we're going to read chapters 50 and 51, which is also, I'm going to mention too, been very helpful to me because I know most of my Greek numerals, obviously the I is the 1, the V is the 5, the X is the 10, the C is the 100. That's easy because they're the 100 cents in a dollar. M, 1,000. But for some reason, L was one I always would forget. If it was if it was a 50, if it was a 500, what was L? Thanks to these chapters, the ones that we've been doing, I now remember, for now at least, that L means 50, which may have also, for those of you who had noticed my hesitation sometimes when I would read out the chapter number, it's because I had to go like, oh yeah, L is 50, and then figure out the chapter number. All right, so today we're reading chapters L and LI, also known as 50 and 51. Let us begin with chapter 50. These murder and jury statistics remind me of a certain very extraordinary trial and execution of 20 years ago. It is a scrap of history familiar to all old Californians and worthy to be known by other peoples of the earth that love simple, straightforward justice, unencumbered with nonsense. I would apologize for this digression, but for the fact that the information I'm about to offer is apology enough in itself. And since I digress constantly anyhow, perhaps it is as well to eschew apologies altogether and thus prevent their growing irksome. Captain Ned Blakely. That name will answer as well as any other fictitious one, for he was still with the living at last accounts and may not desire to be famous. Sailed ships out of the harbor of San Francisco for many years. He was a stalwart, warm-hearted, eagle-eyed veteran who had been a sailor nearly 50 years, a sailor from early boyhood. He was a rough, honest creature, full of pluck, and just as full of hard-headed simplicity, too. He hated trifling conventionalities. Business was the word with him. He had all a sailor's vindictiveness against the quips and quirks of the law, and steadfastly believed that the first and last aim and object of the law and lawyers was to defeat justice. He sailed for the Chincha Islands in command of a guano ship. He had a fine crew, but his Negro mate was his pet. On him he had for years lavished his admiration and esteem. It was Captain Ned's first voyage to the Chinchas, but his fame had gone before him. The fame of being a man who would fight at the dropping of a handkerchief when imposed upon and would stand no nonsense. It was a fame well earned. Arrived in the islands, he found that the staple of conversation was the exploits of one Bill Noakes, a bully, the mate of a trading ship. This man had created a small reign of terror there. At 9 o'clock at night, Captain Ned, all alone, was pacing his deck in the starlight. A form ascended the side and approached him. Captain Ned said, "Who goes there?" "I'm Bill Noakes, the best man in the islands." "What do you want aboard this ship?" "I've heard of Captain Ned Blakely, and one of us is a better man than t'other. I'll know which before I go ashore." "You've come to the right shop. I'm your man. I'll learn you to come aboard this ship without an invite. Without an invite." He seized Noakes, backed him against the mainmast, pounded his face to a pulp, and then threw him overboard. Noakes was not convinced. He returned the next night, got the pulp renewed, and went overboard head first as before. He was satisfied. A week after this, while Noakes was carousing with the sailor crowd on shore, at noonday, Captain Ned's colored mate came along, and Noakes tried to pick a quarrel with him. The Negro evaded the trap and tried to get away. Noakes followed him up. The Negro began to run. Noakes fired on him with a revolver and killed him. Half a dozen sea captains witnessed the whole affair. Noakes retreated to the small after cabin of his ship with 2 other bullies and gave out that death would be the portion of any man that intruded there. There was no attempt made to follow the villains. There was no disposition to do it, and indeed very little thought of such an enterprise. There were no courts and no officers. There was no government. The islands belonged to Peru, and Peru was far away. She had no official representative on the ground, and neither had any other nation. However, Captain Ned was not perplexing his head about such things. They concerned him not. He was boiling with rage and furious for justice. At 9 o'clock at night, he loaded a double-barreled gun with slugs, fished out a pair of handcuffs, got a ship's lantern, summoned his quartermaster, and went ashore. He said, "Do you see that ship there at the dock?" "Aye, aye, sir." "It's the Venus." "Aye, aye, sir." You know me." "Aye, aye, sir." "Very well, then. Take the lantern, carry it just under your chin. I'll walk behind you and rest this gun barrel on your shoulder, pointing forward, so. Keep your lantern well up, so's I can see things ahead of you good. I'm going to march in on Noakes and take him, and jug the other chaps. If you flinch, well, you know me." "Aye, aye, sir." In this order, they filed aboard softly, arrived at Noakes's den. The quartermaster pushed the door open, and the lantern revealed the 3 desperadoes sitting on the floor. Captain Ned said, "I'm Ned Blakely. I've got you under fire. Don't you move without orders, any of you. You 2 kneel down in the corner, faces to the wall. Now, Bill Noakes, put these handcuffs on. Now come up close. Quartermaster, fasten 'em. All right. Don't stir, sir. Quartermaster, put the key in the outside of the door. Now, men, I'm going to lock you 2 in, and if you try to burst through this door, well, you've heard of me. Bill Noakes, fall in ahead and march. All set. Quartermaster, lock the door." Noakes spent the night on board Blakely's ship, a prisoner under strict guard. Early in the morning, Captain Ned called in all the sea captains in the harbor and invited them, with nautical ceremony, to be present on board his ship at 9 o'clock to witness the hanging of Noakes at the yard arm. "What? That man has not been tried." "Of course he didn't. Of course he hasn't. But didn't he kill the nigger?" "Certainly he did, but you are not thinking of hanging him without a trial." "Trial? What do I want to try him for if he killed the nigger?" "Oh, Captain Ned, this will never do. Think how it will sound." "Sound be hanged. Didn't he kill the nigger?" Certainly, Captain Ned. Nobody denies that, but then I'm going to hang him. That's all. Everybody I've talked to talks just the same way you do. Everybody says he killed the nigger. Everybody knows he killed the nigger. And yet every lubber of you wants him tried for it. I don't understand such bloody foolishness as that. Tried! Mind you, I don't object to trying him if it's got to be done to give satisfaction. And I'll be there and chip in and help too. But put it off till afternoon? Put it off till afternoon, for I'll have my hands middling full till after the burying." "Why, what do you mean? Are you going to hang him anyhow? And try him afterward?" "Didn't I say I was going to hang him? I never saw such people as you. What's the difference? You ask a favor and then you ain't satisfied when you get it. Before or after's all one. You know how the trial will go. He killed the nigger. Say, I must be going. If your mate would like to come to the hanging, fetch him along. I like him." There was a stir in the camp. The captains came in a body and pleaded with Captain Ned not to do this rash thing. They promised that they would create a court composed of captains of the best character. They would impanel a jury. They would conduct everything in a way becoming the serious nature of the business in hand, and give the case an impartial hearing and the accused a fair trial. And they said it would be murder, and punishable by the American courts if he persisted and hung the accused on his ship. They pleaded hard. Captain Ned said, "Gentlemen, I'm not stubborn and I'm not unreasonable. I'm always willing to do just as near right as I can. How long will it take?" "Probably only a little while." "And can I take him up on the shore and hang him as soon as you are done?" "If he is proven guilty, he shall be hanged without unnecessary delay." If he's proven guilty. Great Neptune, ain't he guilty? This beats my time. Why, you all know he's guilty. But at last they satisfied him that they were projecting nothing underhanded. Then he said, "Well, all right. You go on and try him, and I'll go down and overhaul his conscience and prepare him to go. Like enough he needs it, and I don't want to send him off without a show for hereafter." This was another obstacle. They finally convinced him that it was necessary to have the accused in court. Then they said they would send a guard to bring him. "No, sir. I prefer to fetch him myself. He don't get out of my hands. Besides, I've got to go to the ship to get a rope, anyway." The court assembled with due ceremony, empaneled the jury, and presently Captain Ned entered, leading the prisoner with one hand and carrying a Bible and a rope in the other. He seated himself by the side of his captive and told the court to up anchor and make sail. Then he turned a searching eye on the jury and detected Noakes's friends, the two bullies. He strode over and said to them confidentially, "You're here to interfere, you see. Now you vote right, do you hear? Or else there'll be a double-barreled inquest here when the trial's off, and your remainders will go home in a couple of baskets." The caution was not without fruit. The jury was a unit. The verdict? Guilty. Captain Ned sprang to his feet and said, "Come along. You're my meat now, my lad, anyway. Gentlemen, you've done yourselves proud. I invite you all to come and see that I do it all straight. Follow me to the canyon, a mile above here." The court informed him that a sheriff had been appointed to do the hanging, and Captain Ned's patience was at an end. His wrath was boundless. The subject of a sheriff was judiciously dropped. When the crowd arrived at the canyon, Captain Ned climbed a tree and arranged the halter, then came down and noosed his man. He opened his Bible and laid aside his hat. Selecting a chapter at random, he read it through in a deep bass voice and with sincere solemnity. Then he said, "Lad, you are about to go aloft and give an account of yourself, and the lighter a man's manifest is, as far as sin's concerned, the better for him. Make a clean breast, man, and carry a log with you that'll bear inspection. You killed the nigger?" No reply. A long pause. The captain read another chapter, pausing from time to impress the effect. Then he talked an earnest, persuasive sermon to him and ended by repeating the question, "Did you kill the nigger?" No reply, other than a malignant scowl. The captain now read the first and second chapters of Genesis with deep feeling, paused a moment, closed the book reverently, and said with a perceptible savor of satisfaction, "There, 4 chapters. There's few that would have took the pains with you that I have." Then he swung up the condemned and made the rope fast, stood by and timed him half an hour with his watch, and then delivered the body to the court. A little after, as he stood contemplating the motionless figure, a doubt came into his face. Evidently he felt a twinge of conscience, a misgiving, and he said with a sigh, "Well, perhaps I ought to burnt him maybe, but I was trying to do for the best." When the history of this affair reached California, it was in the early days, it made a deal of talk, but did not diminish the captain's popularity in any degree. It increased it, indeed. California had a population that inflicted justice after a fashion that was simplicity and primitiveness itself, and could therefore admire appreciatively when the same fashion was followed elsewhere. Okay, and now, chapter 51. Vice flourished luxuriantly during the heyday of our flush times. The saloons were overburdened with custom. So were the police courts, the gambling dens, the brothels, and the jails, unfailing signs of high prosperity in a mining region, in any region for that matter. Is it not so? A crowded police court docket is the surest of all signs that trade is brisk and money plenty. Still, there is one other sign. It comes last, but when it does come, it establishes beyond cavil that the flush times are at the flood. This is the birth of the literary paper. The Weekly Occidental, devoted to literature, made its appearance in Virginia. All the literary people were engaged to write for it. Mr. F. was to edit it. He was a felicitous skirmisher with a pen and a man who could say happy things in a crisp, neat way. Once, while editor of the Union, he had disposed of a labored, incoherent, 2-column attack made upon him by a contemporary with a single line, which at first glance seemed to contain a solemn and tremendous compliment, viz., The logic of our adversary resembles the peace of God, and left it to the reader's memory and afterthought to invest the remark with another and more different meaning by supplying for himself and at his own leisure the rest of the scripture, in that it passeth understanding. He once said of a little, half-starved wayside community that had no subsistence except what they could get by preying upon chance passengers who stopped over with them a day when traveling by the overland stage, that in their church service they had altered the Lord's Prayer to read, "Give us this day our daily stranger." We expected great things of the Occidental. Of course, it could not get along without an original novel, and so we made arrangements to hurl into the work the full strength of the company. Mrs. F. was an able romancist of the ineffable school. I know no other name to apply to a school whose heroes are all dainty and all perfect. She wrote the opening chapter and introduced a lovely blonde simpleton who talked nothing but pearls and poetry and who was virtuous to the verge of eccentricity. She also introduced a young French duke of aggravated refinement in love with the blonde. Mr. F. followed next week with a brilliant lawyer who set about getting the duke's estates into trouble, and a sparkling young lady of high society who fell to fascinating the duke and impairing the appetite of the blonde. Mr. D., a dark and bloody editor of one of the dailies, followed Mr. F. the third week, introducing a mysterious Rosicrucian who transmuted metals, held consultations with the devil in a cave at dead of night, and cast the horoscope of the several heroes and heroines in such a way as to provide plenty of trouble for their future careers and breed a solemn and awful public interest in the novel. He also introduced a cloaked and masked melodramatic miscreant, put him on a salary, and set him on the midnight track of the Duke with a poisoned dagger. He also created an Irish coachman with a rich brogue and placed him in the service of the society young lady with an ulterior mission to carry billet doux to the Duke. About this time there arrived in Virginia a dissolute stranger with a literary turn of mind. Rather seedy he was, but very quiet and unassuming, almost diffident indeed. He was so gentle, and his manners were so pleasing and kindly, whether he was sober or intoxicated, that he made friends of all who came in contact with him. He applied for literary work, offered conclusive evidence that he wielded an easy and practical pen, and so Mr. F. engaged him at once to help write the novel. His chapter was to follow Mr. D.'s, and mine was to come next. Now, what does this fellow do but go off and get drunk and then proceed to his quarters and set to work with his imagination in a state of chaos, and that chaos in a condition of extravagant activity? The result may be guessed. He scanned the chapters of his predecessors, found plenty of heroes and heroines already created, and was satisfied with them. He decided to introduce no more. With all the confidence that whiskey inspires and all the easy complacency it gives to its servant, he then launched himself lovingly into his work. He married the coachman to the society young lady for the sake of the scandal, married the Duke to the blonde stepmother for the sake of the sensation, stopped the desperado's salary, created a misunderstanding between the devil and the Rosicrucian, threw the Duke's property into the wicked lawyer's hands, made the lawyer's upbraiding conscience drive him to drink, thence to delirium tremens, thence to suicide, broke the coachman's neck, let his widow succumb to contumely, neglect, poverty, and consumption, caused the blonde to drown herself, leaving her clothes on the bank with the customary note pinned to them for giving the Duke and hoping he would be happy, revealed to the Duke, by means of the usual strawberry mark on the left arm, that he had married his own long-lost mother and destroyed his long-lost sister, instituted the proper and necessary suicide of the Duke and the Duchess in order to compass poetical justice, opened the earth and let the Rosicrucian through, accompanied with the accustomed smoke and thunder and smell of brimstone, and finished with the promise that in the next chapter, after holding a general inquest, he would take up the surviving character of the novel and tell what became of the devil. It read with singular smoothness, and with a dead earnestness that was funny enough to suffocate a body. But there was war when it came in. The other novelists were furious. The mild stranger, not yet more than half sober, stood there under a scathing fire of vituperation, meek and bewildered, looking from one to another of his assailants, and wondering what he could have done to invoke such a storm. When a lull came at last, he said his way gently and appealingly, said he did not rightly remember what he had written, but was sure he had tried to do the best he could, and knew his object had been to make the novel not only pleasant and plausible, but instructive, and... The bombardment began again. The novelist assailed his ill-chosen adjectives and demolished them with a storm of denunciation and ridicule. And so the siege went on. Every time the stranger tried to appease the enemy, he only made matters worse. Finally, he offered to rewrite the chapter. This arrested hostilities. The indignation gradually quieted down, peace reigned again, and the sufferer retired in safety and got him to his own citadel. But on the way thither, the evil angel tempted him, and he got drunk again. And again, his imagination went mad. He led the heroes and heroines a wilder dance than ever, and yet all through it ran that same convincing air of honesty and earnestness that had marked his first work. He got the characters into the most extraordinary situations, put them through the most surprising performances, and made them talk the strangest talk. But the chapter cannot be described. It was symmetrically crazy. It was artistically absurd, and it had explanatory footnotes that were fully as curious as the text. I remember one of the situations and will offer it as an example of the whole. He altered the character of the brilliant lawyer and made him a great-hearted, splendid fellow, gave him fame and riches, and set his age at 33 years. Then he made the blonde discover, through the help of the Rosicrucian and the melodramatic miscreant, that while the Duke loved her money ardently and wanted it, he secretly felt a sort of leaning toward the society young lady. Stung to the quick, she tore her affections from him and bestowed them with tenfold power upon the lawyer, who responded with consuming zeal. But the parents would none of it. What they wanted in the family was a duke, and a duke they were determined to have, though they confessed that next to the duke, the lawyer had their preference. Necessarily, the blonde now went into a decline. The parents were alarmed. They pleaded with her to marry the duke, but she steadfastly refused and pined on. Then they laid a plan. They told her to wait a year and a day, and if at the end of that time she still felt that she could not marry the duke, she might marry the lawyer with their full consent. The result was as they had foreseen. Gladness came again, and the flush of returning health. Then the parents took the next step in their scheme. They had the family physician recommend a long sea journey and much land travel for the thorough restoration of the blonde's strength, and they invited the Duke to be of the party. They judged that the Duke's constant presence and the lawyer's protracted absence would do the rest, for they did not invite the lawyer. So they set sail in a steamer for America, and the third day out, when their seasickness called truce and permitted them to take their first meal at the public table, behold, there sat the lawyer. The Duke and party made the best of an awkward situation. The voyage progressed, and the vessel neared America. But by and by, 200 miles off New Bedford, the ship took fire. She burned to the water's edge. Of all her crew and passengers, only 30 were saved. They floated about the sea half an afternoon and all night long. Among them were our friends. The lawyer, by superhuman exertions, had saved the blonde and her parents, swimming back and forth 200 yards and bringing one each time. The girl first. The Duke had saved himself. In the morning, 2 whale ships arrived on the scene and sent their boats. The weather was stormy, and the embarkation was attended with much confusion and excitement. The lawyer did his duty like a man, helped his exhausted and insensible blonde, her parents, and some others into a boat. The Duke helped himself in. Then a child fell overboard at the other end of the raft, and the lawyer rushed thither and helped half a dozen people fish it out under the stimulus of its mother's screams. Then he ran back, a few seconds too late. The blonde's boat was under way, so he had to take the other boat and go to the other ship. The storm increased and drove the vessels out of sight of each other, drove them whither it would. When it calmed at the end of 3 days, the blonde ship was 700 miles north of Boston, and the other about 700 south of that port. The blonde's captain was bound on a whaling cruise in the North Atlantic and could not go back such a distance or make a port without orders, such being nautical law. The lawyer's captain was to cruise in the North Pacific, and he could not go back or make a port without orders. All the lawyer's money and baggage were in the blonde's boat and went to the blonde's ship, so his captain made him work his passage as a common sailor. When both ships had been cruising nearly a year, the one was off the coast of Greenland and the other in Bering Strait. The blonde had long ago been well nigh persuaded that her lawyer had been washed overboard and lost just before the whale ships reached the raft. And now, under the pleadings of her parents and the Duke, she was at last beginning to nerve herself for the doom of the covenant and prepare for the hated marriage. But she would not yield a day before the date set. The weeks dragged on, the time narrowed. Orders were given to deck the ship for the wedding, a wedding at sea among icebergs and walruses. 5 days more and all would be over. So the blonde reflected with a sigh and a tear. Oh, where was her true love? And why did he not come and save her? At that moment, he was lifting his harpoon to strike a whale in Bering Strait, 5,000 miles away by the way of the Arctic Ocean, or 20,000 by the way of the Horn. That was the reason. He struck, but not with perfect aim. His foot slipped, and he fell in the whale's mouth and went down his throat. He was insensible 5 days. Then he came to himself and heard voices. Daylight was streaming through a hole cut in the whale's roof. He climbed out and astonished the sailors who were hoisting blubber up a ship's side. He recognized the vessel, flew aboard, surprised the wedding party at the altar, and exclaimed, "Stop the proceedings! I'm here! Come to my arms, my own!" There were footnotes to this extravagant piece of literature wherein the author endeavored to show that the whole thing was within the possibilities. He said he got the incident of the whale traveling from Bering Strait to the coast of Greenland, 5,000 miles in 5 days through the Arctic Ocean, from Charles Reade's Love Me Little, Love Me Long, and considered that that established the fact that the thing could be done. And he instanced Jonah's adventure as proof that a man could live in a whale's belly, and added that if a preacher could stand it 3 days, a lawyer could surely stand it 5. There was a fiercer storm than ever in the editorial sanctum now, and the stranger was peremptorily discharged and his manuscript flung at his head. But he had already delayed things so much that there was not time for someone else to rewrite the chapter, and so the paper came out without any novel in it. It was but a feeble, struggling, stupid journal, and the absence of the novel probably shook public confidence. At any rate, before the first side of the next issue went to press, the Weekly Occidental died as peacefully as an infant. An effort was made to resurrect it with the proposed advantage of a telling new title, and Mr. F. said that The Phoenix would be just the name for it, because it would give the idea of a resurrection from its dead ashes in a new and undreamed-of condition of splendor. But some low-priced smarty on one of the dailies suggested that we call it the Lazarus, and inasmuch as the people were not profound in scriptural matters, but thought the resurrected Lazarus and the dilapidated mendicant that begged in the rich man's gateway were one and the same person, the name became the laughingstock of the town and killed the paper for good and all. I was sorry enough, for I was very proud of being connected with a literary paper, prouder than I have ever been of anything else since, perhaps. I had written some rhymes for it. Poetry, I considered it, and it was a great grief to me that the production was on the first side of the issue that was not completed, and hence did not see the light. But time brings its revenge. I can put it in here. It will answer in peace of a tear dropped to the memory of the lost Occidental. The title, not the chief idea, but the vehicle that bears it, was probably suggested by the old song called The Raging Canal, but I cannot remember now. I do remember, though, that at the time I thought my doggerel was one of the ablest poems of the age. There is at least one footnote in this I'm just going to say, so I'll do little hands to indicate the footnote. Now here's the poem. The Aged Pilot Man. On the Erie Canal it was, all on a summer's day, I sailed forth with my parents, far away, to Albany. From out the clouds at noon that day there came a dreadful storm that piled the billows high about and filled us with alarm. A man came rushing from a house, saying, "Snub up your boat, I pray." Snub up is the customary canal technicality for tie up. Let's repeat. A man came rushing from a house, saying, "Snub up your boat, I pray. Snub up your boat, snub up, alas. Snub up while yet you may." Our captain cast one glance astern, then forward glanced he, and said, My wife and little ones I never more shall see. Said Dollinger, the pilot man, in noble words but few, Fear not, but lean on, Dollinger, and he will fetch you through. The boat drove on, the frightened mules tore through the rain and wind, and bravely still, in danger's post, the whip boy strode behind. Tore through the wind and the rain. Come board, the captain cried, nor tempt so wild a storm. But still the raging mules advanced, and still the boy strode on. Then said the captain to us all, Alas, 'tis plain to me, the greater danger is not there, but here upon the sea. So let us strive while life remains to save all souls on board, and then if die at last we must, I cannot speak the word. Said Dollinger, the pilot man, towering above the crew, Fear not, but trust in Dollinger, and he will fetch you through. Low bridge, all heads went down, the laboring bark sped on. A mill we passed a church, hamlets and fields of corn, and all the world came out to see and chased along the shore. Crying, Alas, alas, the sheeted rain, the wind, the tempest roar! Alas, the gallant ship and crew, can nothing help them more? And from our deck sad eyes looked out across the stormy scene, the tossing wake of billows aft, the bending forests green. The chickens sheltered under carts in lee of barn the cows, the scurrying swine with straw in mouth, the wild spray from our bows. She balances, she wavers, now let her go out. If she misses, stays, and broaches too, we're ale. Then with a shout, Hooray, hooray, avast, belay, take in more sail, Lord, what a gale. Ho, boy, haul taut on the hind mule's tail. Ho, lighten ship, ho, man the pump, ho, hostler, heave the lead. A quarter 3, 'tis shoaling fast, 3 feet large, 3 feet. 3 feet scant, I cried in fright. Oh, is there no retreat? Said Dollinger, the pilot man, as on the vessel flew, Fear not, but trust in Dollinger, and he will fetch you through. A panic struck the bravest hearts, the boldest cheek turned pale, for plain to all this shoaling said, a leak had burst the ditch's bed. And straight as bold from crossbow sped, our ship swept on with shoaling lead, before the fearful gale. Sever the tow line, cripple the mules, too late, there comes a shock. Another length, and the fated craft would have swum in the saving lock. Then gathered together the shipwrecked crew and took one last embrace, while sorrowful tears from despairing eyes ran down each hopeless face. And some did think of their little ones, whom they never more might see, and others of waiting wives at home, and mothers that grieved would be. But of all the children of misery there on that poor stinking frame, but one spake words of hope and faith, and I worshipped as they came. Said Dollinger, the pilot man, O brave heart, strong and true, fear not, but trust in Dollinger, for he will fetch you through. Lo, scarce the words have passed his lips, the dauntless prophet saith, when every soul about him seeth, a wonder crowns his faith. And count ye all, both great and small, as numbered with the dead, for mariner for 40 year, on Erie, boy and man, I never yet saw such a storm, or want with it began. So overboard a keg of nails, and anvils 3 we threw, likewise 4 bales of gunny sacks, 200 pounds of glue, 2 sacks of corn, 4 ditto wheat, a box of books, a cow, a violin, Lord Byron's works, a ripsaw, and a sow. A curve, the dangers grow. Labboard, starboard, steady so. Hard a port doll, helm a lee. Haw the head mule, the aft one gee. Luff, bring her to the wind. For straight a farmer brought a plank mysteriously inspired, and laying it unto the ship, in silent awe retired. Then every sufferer stood amazed, that pilot man before a moment stood, their wonder turned, and speechless walked ashore. Well, Mark Twain has probably written some great poetry, but I would not say that was it. Although, as he did say, he thought it was one of the ablest poems of the age back when he wrote it. So, thank you very much for joining me today. I think I will go ahead and open up the voting for our next book just because I love voting on the next books. So I'm going to go ahead and open that poll, and if you want to start voting on it, we're going to have just over a week in which to vote. I won't choose the new one until the Monday after, so we won't pick it until the 19th, but I'm just going to open up the poll today because we can. Why not? So if you want to go ahead and start thinking about what you want to read next after we conclude Roughing It by Mark Twain, I'm going to open that poll today. And yeah, if you see something there that somebody else has nominated, give it a vote. And if you don't see something there that you would love to read together, then nominate it yourself. It should just be something that's in the public domain so that we can read it without copyright. All right, thank you very much for today, though. We are still reading Roughing It by Mark Twain, and we have just 2 weeks left to conclude our book together. So thank you very much for joining me today. I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your weekend, and I will see you next Monday for more chapters from Roughing It. Bye, friends.